program is sponsored tonight by AARP. It's being simulcast on our radio partner, that would be KOB AM. Joining us on the stage, Republican candidate Janice Arnold-Jones and Democratic candidate Michelle Lujan Grisham. Both candidates have agreed to the debate rules. Each candidate will have 1 minute to make an opening statement. Later, they will have 1 minute for a closing statement. The candidates will be given 1 minute to answer each question and then 45 seconds each for a rebuttal. Later, the candidates will be allowed to ask the other candidate a question. The answers will be limited to 1 minute, and each will have 45 seconds for rebuttal. Michelle Lujan Grisham won the coin toss. She is elected to go first with her opening statement. Michelle.
Thank you. Good evening. Today, too many New Mexicans are worried about keeping their jobs or even having one, and too many others are going without health care. And our children don't have the same educational opportunities that we once had. Congress is ignoring the very real problems that New Mexico families face. Now, I often talk about my mother who lives with me because she can't afford to live on her own. Now we have 3 generations under one roof because my daughter has moved back home so that she can afford to go to college. And when she graduates, she may not be able to find a job. And even if she does, she may face a mountain of debt. Today, Sandia high school students will face many of those same challenges. I understand the emotional and financial burdens that New Mexico families face. As a widow, single mother, and a caregiver, these struggles are real to me. And that's why I'll be a champion for the middle class, and I'll fight to put New Mexicans back to work, and I will stand strong against any attacks that against our families' financial security. I'm Michelle Lujan Grisham, and I am ready to stand up for you in Congress.
Janice Arnold-Jones, your opening statement.
I'm so grateful to be here this evening. I am Janice Arnold-Jones. I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives in New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, and I want your vote. New Mexico and our nation are facing profound problems that are getting worse. We must change course. Our national debt is out of control. Our vital entitlement programs are running out of money. Our economy is floundering under the weight of heartbreaking levels of unemployment, much of it long term. America is losing influence in the world. Iran is on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons, while our own laboratories and our military are facing disastrous cuts. New Mexico can do better. America can do better. We will all do better together. This election is about deciding whom to trust. You trusted me in Santa Fe. Trust me in Washington. Thank you.
All right, to our first question. Many New Mexicans believe job one in this country is getting people back to work, and it's probably easier said than done. New Mexico lost more than 12,000 jobs last year alone. How do you stop the bleeding, and how do you help turn the employment situation around? And we're going to begin with Janice Arnold-Jones.
The first step is for Congress to pass a budget. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but in a federally dependent state, which is New Mexico, many paychecks are dependent upon having a budget. We have not had a budget in over 3 years, and that is paychecks that are not arriving. But in addition to that, there are a few other things that we can do. We need to step up and pull back regulation right this minute. Red tape is choking our small businesses, and it is the small businesses, not our federal sector, that actually will be expanding our economy. And the next step is to work on tax reform. Taxes must be simple, fair, and easy to administer. These steps will get us working again.
Michelle, when it comes to job losses in this state, this country, how do you as a congresswoman stop the bleeding and get more people on the job?
Well, let's talk about quickly that the 12,000 job lost in New Mexico. New Mexico depends much on federal investments and federal jobs as a result. And the current inability of Congress to focus on jobs and investments in states like New Mexico hurts New Mexico's economy. That's why we've got to pass the Jobs Bill, the Jobs Act out of Congress. That's infrastructure investment, that's putting plumbers and and carpenters and builders right back to work building hospitals, bridges, and schools. We should be working with Sandia Labs to do spin-off technologies and creating entrepreneurs right here on the ground. So we've got high-tech jobs for the future of our kids coming out of college. And we've got to provide working capital to small businesses. As a small businesswoman, I know that what you need is access to capital. And let's take a lesson from the county and apply those tools to Congress, where we invested in businesses like Lowe's and USC Bags and Friedman Recycling, provide them with low-interest loans and access to capital so they can expand their businesses and hire more New Mexicans. This is an agenda for success for jobs in New Mexico.
Janice, you have 45 seconds for a rebuttal.
Absolutely. Indeed, access to capital is huge. We need to pull back some of the elements of Dodd-Frank that are actually choking our economy. You know, one of the unintended consequences of Dodd-Frank and all the financial bills is the role of appraisers in our housing market. How sad that when there is a need for money, we are at dead stop because of some of the new rules for our appraisers. But when I look at and think about investments, I want you to think about that word, because oftentimes my opponent means spending. Ladies and gentlemen, we are $16 trillion in debt. In order to have the money to invest in programs that we love, we have got to get our debt under control so that we have more choices.
Michelle, you have 45 seconds for your rebuttal.
Thank you. Well, the issue is that we are not having a balanced approach to dealing with a budget, but the budget's not the number one priority. The number one priority is investing in New Mexicans to go back to work immediately. Families are facing tough decisions about whether they pay their mortgages or buy groceries, and we do that by passing the jobs bill immediately. And working capital, we can provide microloans and the same kind of instruments and tools that support local lenders like community banks and credit unions. What we can't do is pass the Ryan Plan, which my opponent supports, which is a 10% cut to the labs, 20,000 jobs lost in New Mexico. These are not the right policies that protect New Mexico working families.
Now to question two. Let's talk money management for a moment. For those of us lucky to have jobs, we have money coming in, and we, of course, have money going out. The U.S. government seems to have a lot of money that's going out, not as much coming in. What's your plan for getting a grip on this? And we'll start with Michelle.
Thank you. Well, it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that balanced approach. We definitely have to be careful about spending money where we've got programs that are inefficient and ineffective. We don't have the right outcomes. We certainly don't want to engage in wasteful spending. But while we do that, we need to make sure that we're bringing revenue into this country. And there are several ways to do that. One, the wealthiest of Americans need to pay their fair share of taxes. We must let the Bush tax cuts expire for the wealthiest of Americans, or that top 2%. We have to close corporate loopholes. You know, in this country, we're continuing to subsidize big oil and gas. When those companies are paying 18% federal income tax and you and I are paying 30+% income tax, something is wrong. Let's close those loopholes for special interests in oil and gas. Let's not subsidize a $137 billion profit-making engine. That gives us the revenues to deal with the deficit, to attack the debt, and to invest in working families in New Mexico today.
Janice, as a congresswoman, what would you do to get a grip on this revenue spending imbalance?
First off, you have to look at it straight on. We are spending $3.6 trillion, and we're only taking in $2.2. Y'all have checkbooks. You know that does not work. We are going to have to make some very tough decisions. No matter what you think about on the periphery, at the end of the day, we have a spending problem that is compounded by agencies like PIMCO, who announced today that they are going to increase the interest that is being charged on our debt, which will complicate this yet again. So there are no easy answers here. We are going to have to make some tough choices. Now, that being said, so where do we cut first? I think you have to look at administration. We take all of the low-hanging fruit. You exercise every single step that you can to be fiscally responsible, and then we will make those very tough decisions. But I have to go back to my opponent who wants to mix up income taxes. Now, y'all know I spent 8 years on a tax committee, and a corporate tax and a personal income tax, they are not the same.
Michelle, you have 45 seconds for a rebuttal.
But there are two sources of revenue, and in fact, the income tax on the wealthiest of Americans provides $1 trillion back to the federal budget, as an example. And why are we subsidizing big oil and gas? That's $3 billion. Here's another idea. If we're going to look at where we can have savings, let's address the Affordable Care Act and the notion that Medicare is now prohibited from negotiating for fair drug prices. This is hundreds of millions of dollars back to the federal budget, which allow you to deal with the deficit and deal with the debt, while at the same time making smart investments in moving the economy. We know that cutting your way out of this problem leads to even further financial disasters. And if we don't do that, then we're facing sequestration, which is a debt reduction effort by Congress who's failed to take responsibility, where they're going to cut everything by 10%. That's more job losses to New Mexico.
Janice, your rebuttal?
Again, we've got to watch the numbers. To say that the rich, the millionaires in our country would contribute $1 trillion, let's look at those numbers. If we took every millionaire in the country, they could provide revenue for a month. And then what? Because you would take all of their assets. Those are not fair comparisons. But in fact, we have got to go back in and make sure that we are actually being fiscally responsible. And you can talk about health care all day long. But the truth is our government is much broader than that. But if we stay in debt, the health care that we all want is not going to be there.
Now to question 3 in our District 1 debate. Every few years we go through this process where a candidate stands up here and tells us, I'm going to work for you. But then they get to Congress and they're all big and important and everyone wants to be their friend and lobbyists are working them over. There's money everywhere. How do you plan to stay focused on what New Mexico needs and not become just another re-election soundbite? Janice.
I love that question. Thank you. Having served 8 years in the New Mexico legislature, I understand what it is like to be lobbied and also not lobbied. When you have a set of principles and lobbyists know that you cannot be bought, you actually have a lot of time to focus. But the way you actually do this is by staying connected with folks back home. Now, I have proposed a number of times that we have to change the schedule of Congress. Congress currently goes to work on Tuesday morning to get out and go home Thursday at noon. Hard to build relationships. I have been working, and I propose that Congress go to work Monday morning through Saturday, 3 weeks on, 2 weeks off, because what I know is there needs to be time in the district where we have enough time to talk about the problems and to listen to you, because what I have learned about New Mexicans is you actually have the answers if I take the time to listen.
Michelle, what are you going to do if you go to Washington? What are you going to do to make sure you remember who you're working for?
Well, I'll tell you, I've never forgotten who I've worked for, which is exactly why I worked for 3 different governors, both Republican and Democrat, for 17 years in state government serving the public. We had incredible successes reaching across the aisle and doing things like expanding the number of school-based health centers, protecting senior citizens, attacking scam artists and telemarketers who were literally stealing the life savings of seniors, building the new state lab. These are the kinds of efforts, and in the county commission. In fact, we cleaned up county government. We put New Mexicans back to work. These are the kinds of efforts, your integrity, your independence, your desire to make a difference. And given the fact that as a single mom and a caregiver, well, I don't forget about what the needs are of New Mexicans and how tough those struggles are every day. That's how you're motivated to continue to focus on doing what's right and improving the quality of lives for New Mexico. I've done that my entire career, and I assure you I will continue to do that in Congress.
Janice, your rebuttal?
Just very quickly, this is really about paying attention to you. You know, when I was in the legislature, we talked about many things, certainly way beyond health care. And what I have learned is talking with you, there are many sides to every question. Making sure that you understand all of those sides so you can make the very best decision certainly takes focus. And it was probably one of the things that I enjoyed most, which is also why, with the help of a lot of people, we took the webcams to Santa Fe, because you have a right to participate in your government.
Michelle, your rebuttal.
Well, it's not about focus for me. It's about action. It's about being very clear about what you're doing and why, and about getting those things done. Now, I've got a real record of accomplishments over a 20-year history, including working in the private sector. And when the economy was failing in 2008, I started a successful business which provides health insurance to individuals who have pre-existing conditions and cannot get coverage in any other way. And those high-risk pools, that's what they're called, that provide this coverage, are some of the most successful programs in the entire country, because it's understanding the real life and death situations and issues that New Mexico families face, address those, and certainly be clear about what's harmful in Congress. And I will tell you, the Ryan budget is harmful to New Mexico. It destroys Medicare, it destroys Medicaid, and it's a loss of 20,000 jobs.
Let's move on to question 4. Right now, Congress is as divided as I can ever remember. There might be times when the party line isn't what's best for us as New Mexicans. In those times, can you stand up to your party and say, this does not work for New Mexicans? And also, are you willing to reach across the aisle once in a while? And do you see compromise as a dirty word? Michelle?
Absolutely not. Now, let's talk about something that occurred in the county commission. The county does not invest in regional transportation efforts, but Paseo del Norte interchange is a project that has been on the priority list for state government and federal government for almost a decade. But folks were having partisan fights about who should fund it, why you should fund it, who should start it. So I took a leadership role and decided that the county ought to provide funding. Now, that catalyst led to the city putting in $50 million and the state putting in $30 million and the federal government putting in the rest. And now, for the first time, voters have an option on the entire package to put New Mexicans back to work, to address public safety, and to get people to and from work. It's hundreds of jobs today, and it'll be thousands of jobs in the future. This meant working across the aisle with both parties, taking a leadership position, and standing against the county, who initially determined that these were not investments that we should make. Every investment that improves the quality of life of New Mexico is an investment we should be making.
Janice, are you willing to stand up to your own party if it does not work for New Mexico? And what do you think about compromise?
Standing up for what is right is what I have been doing all of my life. Whether it is helping to write the Criminal Sexual Conduct Code, setting up rape crisis centers in Hawaii and in New Mexico, setting up court watch programs, standing up for what is right is simply what I do. But reaching across the aisle, this bipartisan approach, here's what I have learned as a legislator. You have to have relationships. The fact is why would somebody else give me their vote if they had no idea that I understood their issues, or much less that they could trust what I say? Building those relationships is absolutely vital, and I truly understand that. But, I passed legislation in the New Mexico legislature, and here's the oddity. There are 45 Democrats when I was there and only 25 Republicans. In order to pass legislation, there is not a single piece that did not have a Democratic co-sponsor with me. That's how it works. However, being a cabinet secretary, when you're in a majority body, you don't have to do that.
Michelle, your 45-second rebuttal.
All right, well, let's talk about when I wasn't in the majority, when I was working for Republican Governor Gary Johnson. In that administration, one of the top priorities was removing all regulation, not just necessary regulation. And in that environment, nursing homes were a huge problem, and I couldn't get a single state official with the authority to act to take responsibility. So I went undercover and took responsibility, exposed horrible neglect, and now New Mexico is the only state in the country that does undercover evaluations. And in that administration, with the minority, we created some of the most consumer protection, including requiring background checks for direct care workers and real penalties for nursing homes who neglect their residents. I did that in a Republican environment with the minority by bridging relationships and focusing on the things that really matter.
Janice?
3 points. The first one is the discussion of Paseo del Norte. I appreciate my opponent's zeal, but in fact, in the legislature when I served there, we were funding that project with capital outlay. It really was hardly a discussion, but to say that because of partisan efforts that you led the way is truly an overstatement. The second, Michelle, I'm going to tell you this again. The Ryan proposal is simply that, a proposal. For you to say that I am tied to it in any way, I am a legislator, and proposals are meant to be debated. You can talk about it all day long. It doesn't make it true. And last, I appreciate the undercover activity. But really, I have a question is why, after starting the undercover activity in 1997, did it take so long to be effective?
Let's move on. We're delighted AARP is co-sponsoring our primetime debate this evening. Joining us on the stage is the chairman of the group's legislative committee. That would be Leonel Garza. Good evening, sir. Welcome.
Good evening.
AARP will present the next 3 questions. Mr. Garza, go ahead with your first question.
As healthcare costs rise and Medicare costs increase, what's the best way to improve funding for Medicare?
Janice?
The first step to improve funding for Medicare is to pull back the $716 billion taken from it by the Affordable Care Act. Next most important is to pull back the 27% that will be taken from our providers. If we expect to have a program that actually delivers care to our seniors, there have to be providers. That 27% reduction in reimbursement affects doctors, physician assistants, nurses, nurse practitioners across the board. And the answer to providing the funding to make these changes is to expand our economy. We have to get people working again so that, guess what? They can pay more taxes so people have more choices.
Michelle, your answer?
Here's what we're not going to do. I disagree. The Ryan is a budget that's passed the House 3 times, and here's what it does to Medicare. It turns Medicare into a voucher program, leaving future beneficiaries to have to negotiate with insurance companies on their own, costing seniors $6,400 more. My mom's brave. I can tell you that my mom certainly is in a position to afford those additional copays, and neither am I as her caregiver. Here's what we do to strengthen Medicare today. The Affordable Care Act, in fact, is a terrific opportunity to strengthen Medicare. The $716 billion that Janice just referred to is money that came out of windfall profits to insurance companies, returned right back to Medicare beneficiaries to close the donut hole. Donut hole is the place that seniors end up when they can no longer afford their prescription drugs because their benefit has run out. The Ryan plan takes that same Medicare benefit and puts it towards the general budget. Second thing, we're going to have Medicare negotiate with drug companies billions of dollars. Third thing, I'm out of time. I'll get that in my rebuttal.
You're very well behaved. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Janice, you have 45 seconds.
Michelle, we have to be careful with the facts. First off, the Ryan budget may have passed the House. It does not become a budget until it is passed by the Senate. It is merely a proposal. I hope that you will bring a proposal of your own so we can discuss it. The second thing, to say that that particular proposal was going to gut $6,400, I hope you read the latest proposal because there's nothing close to that. And third, to say that that $716 billion came out of windfall profits is simply not true. It came out of Medicare, and the worst of that is that for every dollar of increased benefits, there is a $15 loss. And if you are not sure, please, there's a website we've put up. It's themichellerecord.com. Go check it out. You can see for yourself.
Michelle?
I disagree entirely. Medicare provides a program or incentive payments to managed care companies called Medicare Advantage. The deal here is that we pay a routine payment to those insurance companies, whether the beneficiary is using health care or not. And those became huge windfall profits that went right to CEO salaries and related issues. And that money absolutely went right back to close the donut hole. Now, I've spent 20 years years being an advocate for Medicare and Medicaid, and I assure you that my interpretation of what's currently occurring in the Affordable Care Act is accurate. And in addition, here's what we need to do with Medicare. What we need to do is focus on preventing and treating chronic disease much more effectively. In New Mexico, where diabetes is one of the number one concerns, this is hundreds of millions of dollars back to Medicare.
Mr. Garza, your second question.
Would you support cuts in Social Security and Medicare to address the budget deficit? Or do you think Social Security and Medicare should be kept separate?
Michelle, why don't you start?
I would not be willing to ever cut the benefits in Medicare or Social Security. These efforts, actually, if we don't sustain those programs, have drastic economic consequences for the future of this country and retirees. These are family issues. I think people forget that Social Security is also a family benefit, providing survivor benefits and dependent benefits. Without those investments, we would have those survivors in a position to be in a situation where they would lose their homes and any hope for the future. Medicare is the same issue. If we don't provide a benefit that reduces healthcare costs of a growing, aging, and disabled population, those are the costs that will cripple this country in the future. The best effort is to continue our investments and shore up the strengths of the programs. The reality is, while we combine the payroll taxes for both these programs, I think there are modernization efforts that we can undertake, but I would never undermine the protections for Social Security and Medicare in this country.
Janice, your answer.
First, if you are over 55, I will stand and make sure that your benefits do not change. Second, for that group, I think it's time that we make sure that the cost of living allowance at least equals inflation. Third, I am looking at the young people in the audience. I cannot make that same promise to you at this time unless we change the age of eligibility. I want that program to be there for you, but I do not want to stand here and not tell you the truth. We are going to have to look at that. But there are some other actions that we can take to improve the solvency, especially of Social Security. We are still siphoning interest off of the Social Security Trust Fund. It's time to put it back so that it is solvent. And last and most important, for both programs, the more people we put back to work, the more people who are paying into the system, the more solvent both programs are, and that is the most important thing we can do.
Michelle, your rebuttal.
Well, as I mentioned in my answer, these are family benefits. When you look out to the audience and you say, for those folks 55 and older, you're fine, which I have to reiterate is exactly the Medicare plan in the Ryan budget. But this is the issue. What about all the young disabled adults and young veterans who are on disability benefits and rely on Social Security and their families? Are we going to say to that population that we're sorry, we're not here for you anymore? We're sorry that this country made this commitment to you, and in spite of working and paying into the system your entire life, it goes away. I don't think that that's the strong country that we build from. I don't think that that's a country that provides a real future for our young people and their families. Putting people back to work is clearly an effort that will make a difference. Why, again, it's so important to get Congress back to work.
Janice.
The DD waiver program in the state of New Mexico is a mess. However, adults with developmental disabilities and our veterans who have come back, especially with traumatic brain injury, will require our support for the rest of their lives. I have been committed to that care since I was elected and well before that. And so when we look at the solvency, that is a very special program.
Mr. Garza has the third and final AARP question. Go ahead.
The Supreme Court made it harder for older workers to prove age discrimination in the workplace. Currently, older workers are having a hard time finding employment in this economy. Do you support the U.S. Senate Bill S-2189, which would restore protections against age discrimination for older workers?
Janice, you're up first.
I have not read S 2189. And so I'm going to take a guess at it, but I like to read the bills. So let's talk about some concepts. I appreciate that younger people need to work. Our population is aging. Our span of being productive has changed. And quite frankly, I find it irresponsible and incomprehensible to ever have age limit requirements. We need the experience of our seniors. We need their wisdom. And to have anything stand in the way, I just can't even understand.
Michelle?
Discrimination of any kind can no longer be tolerated in this country, and that clearly goes to age discrimination for retirees and older workers as well. The reality is that there are so many studies that indicate that retirees who are back in the workplace, whether it's in a brand new full-time job or a part-time job equivalent to the kinds of things that you were doing before retirement, actually improve the health status of this population, which reduces our health care costs and provides a much-needed benefit in the workplace. The reality is that once we get this economy moving, for many jobs, we may not have enough young workers to take those jobs, creating an environment where we have equal access, and it's an economic security, particularly for older women, who often are making less, have less Social Security, less benefits, less private retirement income, and without that working income are at or below the poverty line. We need to do everything we can to create equitable financial security for older workers and their families.
Janice, go ahead with your rebuttal.
I don't have a rebuttal on this one.
Okay, Michelle?
Well, there's so much to talk about in that design. You know, New Mexico has one of the fastest growing grandparents raising grandchildren populations in the country. So when we really talk about these benefits and these programs and incentives that we're going to stamp out discrimination, I really want folks to leave with these are absolutely family issues. Providing the opportunity for older workers to have sufficient income to support their entire family is critical to the health of our economy and the health of New Mexico's economy.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Garza, and thank you, AARP, for those questions. As part of tonight's debate, we also asked KOB viewers to submit questions through KOB.com. Here is our Stuart Dyson with some of those questions. Take it away, Stu.
All right. Our first question comes from John Jones from Albuquerque. And John asks, what is the single greatest threat facing this nation today, and what will you do to help with resolving it?
Michelle, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. I have to say that I'm going to cheat on this answer because we have two significant national threats. One is clearly the economy and this fiscal cliff that we're headed towards if we end up without investments in our economy and putting people back to work, and we have sequestration where we cut all of our programs and investments by 10%. We can't be the strong leader of the future if that's the direction that we're headed in. But it is unfortunate that not a one of us can forget 9/11, and that there are real terrorism issues and extremists in this world that mean harm to Americans and our allies. And we must have a robust military that's designed to invest in modernization, much like the work here in New Mexico for drones, so that we can exercise diplomacy that's robust, like in Pakistan, but making sure that we're prepared to do what's necessary to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
Janice Arnold-Jones, your answer?
It's very clear. The single greatest threat to our nation is our national debt. Now, as a Navy wife, I assure you that I understand what it means to defend this nation. But what cuts at the very status of our country is the debt. We are no longer a force. The bargaining chip that we had in the international community has been significantly diminished. And it is true that our military forces are threatened, but the threat comes from the beginning, which is our national debt. So, making sure that we start pulling back our debt, that we are proactive, that we make a commitment to reduce that debt is probably the single greatest thing that we can do. And in doing so, we will provide security for our children and also remove a moral obligation from their backs that they should not have. Debt is the single greatest threat.
Michelle?
Reality again is that if we would let the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest of America and that top 2% expire, that's $1 trillion that goes right to dealing with the national debt and the deficit. That also gives us the opportunity to manage and invest in the second part of my answer, which is making sure that we're prepared for the real threats in the world and that we can stand firm with our allies on those issues. These are opportunities for us to have a balanced approach that moves the economy forward and provide the investments, including right here at home at Kirtland and Sandia, Los Alamos Labs, so that we're prepared to build an economy that's sustainable for the future and an environment where we are protecting ourselves and our democratic allies across the world.
Janice?
I have to call your attention to some math. So we have heard that the Bush tax cuts will save us $1 trillion. And the CEOs in the healthcare industry, that's another $1 trillion. I hope you're keeping track of the dollars here. So if you really want to deal with our debt, the most important thing we have to do is to get our economy moving. That means pulling back regulations so small business can actually be productive. They need to hire people. We need to make sure that taxes are simple, fair, and easy to administer. And more importantly, we need to make sure that there is an attitude that business should be competitive. Looking to our government to pick out winners and losers has been a sure recipe for lack of success. Let's turn that around. It's time for us to succeed.
Stuart, our second viewer question.
Tom, our next question is from Rio Rancho, and Frank Potter is the guy. He wants to know, if you are elected, would you be willing to push hard for our government to stop sending taxpayer money in the form of aid to so many countries around the world and instead use the money for the things we need here at home?
Janice, why don't you take that one?
Sure. The current foreign aid is about 1% of our total budget. I am not a fan of sending money to countries that don't like us and that actually I call our enemies. However, in order to be a good global citizen, there are times that we need to come together. A good example, years ago, the floods in Bangladesh, the tidal waves. In Japan, when the earthquake and tidal wave hit, yes, we should show up for our friends and support the international community. And I do get this question frequently because I think many people think it's about 25% of our budget. It's less than 1%.
Michelle?
It's an effective investment in making sure that we're engaging in appropriate and robust diplomacy around the world. We're finally building that credibility around the world, and that creates the right partnerships and an opportunity to actually create additional democracies, which reduce those national threats to this country. It is also true that we must return to a domestic agenda, which is why we want to bring those troops home. I'd love to do it sooner than later. We want to be clear about what our priorities are, and that really is about moving the economy forward and being clear that we want to put New Mexicans back to work. I'm going to return to the single most important thing that Congress could do today is pass the jobs bill, spend that infrastructure spending, get people back to work, hit those folks who are hurt the hardest in this down economy, and those are our construction partners, and create an environment where we've got jobs for the future. And these are the kinds of things that will return and restore our economy to a much healthier environment, give us the opportunity to deal with the debt and the deficit. These are smart policies for America.
We seem to be getting off track a little bit. Janice, do you want your rebuttal?
Sure. When it comes to foreign aid, a little bit off track, but let's talk about some solutions. When we pull out of countries like Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, it is easy to say we're going to literally just sever all of our military members and put them in the job market that doesn't exist. We have to think very carefully about how we do that. Our economy is extremely fragile, so putting more people literally on the market without any alternatives is not a good domestic agenda.
Michelle?
I'm not sure I understand that answer. The way that I heard that is that it would be more appropriate to have those folks in conflicts and putting them in harm's way instead of returning them back home and creating an environment where we're engaging in work.
What were you saying, Janice?
I'm saying that to simply sever military members and putting them in the economy is not right. And so when you do that pullback, you have to do so with some planning. There is a discussion that we can have currently on the blocks is 47,000 members of the Navy and the Marines, and I am concerned about them not having jobs. Let's talk about some solutions, and some of those solutions could be beefing up our border, and it means a transition from the military to Border Patrol.
All right, let's move on. Stu, you have our third and final viewer question.
Yep. John Mayer from Albuquerque wants to know, if you are elected, will you make this a lifelong career? All right, John.
How about it, Michelle?
I want to be your congresswoman for as long as I'm making a difference and focusing on the things that really matter and improving the lives of New Mexicans and their families. That's the reason I'm running, is to make a real difference and engaging. I've got a real record of accomplishments, from my private business to my work at the county commission, where we expanded healthcare services, cleaned up county government, invested in jobs in the economy, and the same kind of record of success in state government. We can have those successes again in Congress. Congress must take responsibility for taking immediate action to address these concerns and issues, and I'm going to stay as long as it takes to make those differences for New Mexico families.
Janice, do you want to make Washington your permanent address?
Well, I've already lived there one time. You know, in the 35 years that I have owned 2 small businesses, managed another one, been a Navy wife, where I have actually created programs in every city that we lived in. You know what? I don't need another career. What I need and what I want to do is to take the time to represent you. And for me, the clock is ticking. So I have to be efficient. I have to get it done, because you don't want another career bureaucrat. You want someone who urgently wants to represent you and solve the problems of New Mexico. I have that urgency. The clock is ticking.
Michelle?
Well, again, I mean, I think this is an issue where you want to be able to demonstrate, and I hope that I'm doing that this evening, that I'm running for Congress because I don't think any of us can afford to wait a second longer for a Congress that's willing to compromise and work across the aisle, to focus on the things that really matter, to invest in New Mexico families, to have a balanced approach to solving the problems that have not been addressed in this Congress at all. I am dedicated and committed to doing that job in an effective and responsible manner for as long as I'm able to do that, and quite frankly, for as long as the district will have me.
Janice?
All good thoughts, and just kind of a general question. I'd like to hear what a balanced approach is and how you invest without spending.
All right, we're going to...
I'm waiting for permission.
Yes, people in my ear. We're going to have to move on. Thank you, Stuart Dyson. With so much at stake for young people in this election, we've asked one student from teacher Tim Beck's AP Government class here at Sandia High School to ask a question. And joining us on the stage now is Sean Kasich. And Sean, you're concerned, I know, about the federal deficit and how your generation is going to pay for it. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so the deficit and the subsequent debt of the federal government has increased dramatically over the past few years, dating all the way back to 2000. You two have spoken in generalities, but what specific measures will you take to slow the growth of the deficit so that my generation will not be responsible for repaying over $16 trillion of debt that previous generations are currently accumulating for us?
Good question, Sean. We're going to begin with Janice.
Bravo, Sean. Thank you for that question. You know, this is where it really is important to be a legislator. You have to get in and look at the budget. You have to decide to make some cuts. Now, as a legislator with experience, I know that we're going to take the low-hanging fruit to begin with. And I don't want to get into the weeds here, but here's how this works. You'd be surprised at the budgets that actually fund people that don't exist. Cut that out. Then we're going to have to look at the elements of our government and make some very difficult choices. Because at the end of the day, Sean, you don't deserve this debt hung around your neck. And I believe that debt today is over $50,000 that you are going to have to pay back if we don't address it. And so are there priorities? Of course there are. For me, you do the most important things. You defend our country. You take care of the fragile populations, including people who need our DD waivers, our veterans with traumatic brain injury. You keep your word. Now, there's not a whole lot left to start cutting, but we are going to have to make the really tough choices about all of the other programs, whether it's transportation, infrastructure. I'm sorry, there's a lot to do.
You've got more time. Michelle.
Let's take a step back and remember how we got into the situation that we're in today. All right, we, at the very same time that we went to war, we provided deep tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans and the middle class, which I want to say right now, Sean, I intend to protect because they're hit hardest in this economy. But those two efforts caused us to spiral into a situation where we've got the worst economy ever. Let's also remember that Wall Street did us no favors by making sure that we have a stable financial environment in this country. Given those three factors, I think it's absolutely appropriate to say that a balanced approach is the following. We're going to close the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest of Americans and make them pay their fair share. We're going to make sure that special interests in oil and gas, that they're not being subsidized when they are making record profits in this country, and that's revenue that we can address the deficit, thereby impacting the debt. And we're going to invest in the number one thing that turns the economy around, putting Americans back to work.
Janice, I cut you off. Would you like to continue?
Actually, I will go into my rebuttal. Thank you very much. You know, we've heard about the Bush tax cuts. You know, poor President Bush hasn't been president for a really long time. So we need to kind of get over it. But those tax cuts right now are really helping a lot of people. Special interests. Let's get our facts straight. Oil and gas do not receive special subsidies, and I will be glad to bore you to tears about depletion allowances, depreciation, and all of the things that actually are shared across our manufacturing strata, and they are not special. And investing in our people. You know what? This is all platitudes. The real truth is with regard to Sean's question, you have to do the hard work of making a budget that currently is spending $3.6 trillion come down to spending only 2.2 or whatever is coming in.
Michelle, what would you like to say?
Well, I disagree. So I identified the depletion allowance as an example in the last debate about oil and gas getting special breaks. And here's what it is. It allows a company like Exxon to take as a capital equipment deduction oil in the ground. I am fairly certain that manufacturing companies who are not drilling for oil are not getting this benefit, and they receive other specialized benefits. And the most important issue here is we invested in oil and gas so that we would have affordable energy and reliable power and energy in this country. That's well and good, but today they are making record profits. And in this environment where the middle class is hit hardest, and we're having a conversation about the future of our children and making sure that we create an environment where the economy is robust and reliable again, why would you continue to subsidize those individuals and entities?
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Sean, for that question. I can see your teacher is very proud of you.
Thank you, Sean.
All right, as I mentioned at the top of the debate, we've carved out some time for the candidates to ask each other one question. Janice, what is your question for Michelle?
Michelle, I would like for you to explain the various taxes that actually exist that you would alter, since the depletion allowance you don't understand?
You have 1 minute, Michelle.
All right. Well, I'm pretty sure I understand that just fine. And I also, Janice, appreciate that we're having a debate about tax reform. And so I'm going to restate again the taxes that I think are most important to allow to expire. I want the wealthiest of Americans to pay their fair share. I want to keep the protections for the middle class. We're hit the hardest in this economy. I want to make sure that the loopholes for companies who are incentivized to take their jobs overseas, who are taking deductions and credits for things that do not benefit this country or growing the economy, that those should be removed. I do favor engaging and investing in these tax deductions. I agree that small businesses, being a small business, that we want to reduce corporate taxes. Those taxes, I think, are aggressive and do cause small businesses not to have sufficient resources to expand their businesses. Now, in county government, I held firm on not growing or increasing corporate taxes for our small businesses, and I'll take those same agenda items to Washington and protect the middle class.
Janice, your rebuttal.
Let's just talk about the depletion allowance. You know, I like to get it straight. Depletion allowances apply to everybody who is in the extractive industries, oil and gas, all of the mining companies, including the companies that make clay flower pots. Anybody who is in the extractive industries, and that also includes timber. It is not uncommon for tax policy to deal with an entire industry across the board. You're right, extractive industries are not manufacturing. They are extractive. Manufacturing has a different set of specific tax policies that make them productive.
Michelle, would you like to respond?
Again, I don't see how any of those allowances are productive. We are subsidizing an industry that has record profits, $137 billion in profits in this country, and yet we are investing between $3 and $4 billion in subsidizing them. This is not sound economic policy. This is investing in folks who do not need us to succeed, while we're failing to recognize that many others need that support investment so that they are fairly competing in the marketplace, and so that you're creating an environment where more businesses can succeed and that more businesses can come home and have their businesses expansion and manufacturing plants right here in the good old US of A.
Now, Michelle Lujan Grisham gets to ask Janice Arnold-Jones a question. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Tom. So, Janice, in the campaign, we've had plenty of opportunities to talk frankly about women's health care and women's access to comprehensive health care and reproductive choices. And you have demonstrated empathy for the difficulty that women face in an unwanted pregnancy. However, you are endorsed by an extreme anti-choice organization that does not support a woman's right to choose, even in the cases of rape and incest. For tonight's debate, I want you to clarify where you stand on equality for women, reproductive choice, and the economic security for women and their families.
Michelle, I appreciate that question, because the end of your question is the most important part of the answer. Because if you want to talk about women's equality, then we need to talk about the economy. Women will gain equality. Women will be able to actually have choices when they can put a roof over their head, feed their children, make sure gas is in the car so they can get to work and they can get to a doctor's appointment. That is the real type of equality that women want. But you were asking me specifically about birth control, I'm assuming contraception and abortion, and I make no bones about it. I believe the very last choice that ever should be made is to end the life of an innocent. That being said, the government of the United States has been providing this type of service for women for almost a half a decade. And so it is all readily available. The fact that I'm endorsed by a group that feels one way doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in outlawing anything. But I'm telling you that my belief is in preserving life. It is sacred to me.
You seem inconsistent to me. To gain the endorsement, you have to be pretty clear that you do not believe in a woman's right to choose in cases of rape and incest, and that you also will fight against providing access to contraceptives and birth control and family planning. And if you believe that these are protections for women's economic future, then you have to support those programs. Planned Parenthood is under attack like never before. Those programs which provide 97% of a woman's primary health care, which means we're doing mammograms and breast cancer screening and cervical cancer screening, saving the lives of these women and making sure that they're around for their family's financial security. Are you going to stand against this organization and the Tea Party extremists in the House who have done everything they can to cut those services and benefits for women?
Janice, you have 45 seconds.
You know, Planned Parenthood is really a diverse organization, and they do some very good things, including providing primary care. I have no problem with that. But the question comes down to moral issues and a question of a challenge to freedom of religion. For those of us who believe that life is sacred, don't ask me to pay for that. Nobody is making it illegal, but don't require me to pay for it. Don't require a religious organization to provide services that they believe are immoral. It comes as simple as that.
All right, we've come to the end of the debate. Each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing statement. We begin with Janice Arnold-Jones.
I love this country. My ancestors fled to this country to find peace and liberty. My mom came to New Mexico to find a new life. New Mexico is my home. It is the state that I love. You know, New Mexico has everything we need. We have everything we need to create wealth and prosperity, from construction to mining, timber, agriculture, oil and gas, wind and sun. We have intellectual might. We have it all. I am asking you to send me to Congress. I'm not flashy. I'm not verbose. I work hard and I listen. The question before all of us is, what are we going to do to change the discourse in our country? None of us like it. I am diligent. I read the bills. If you think that these are important qualities, I will represent you well. This is about trust. You trusted me in Santa Fe. Trust me in Washington. Thank you.
Michelle, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Tom. I want to thank KOB and Sandia High School and AARP for sponsoring this important debate. Now, I've got deep roots in this community. Many of you know that, and I'm very proud of that heritage because it means that I know New Mexico, and more importantly, it means that I know New Mexicans. Now, I've spent my entire career fighting for New Mexico families, and as I stated in my opening, I am ready to take that fight to Washington, D.C., because that's clearly where we are. We're going to have to fight for jobs and economic security for the middle class. We're going to have to fight to make sure that we aren't saddling our college students with more debt today than all of the auto and credit card debt in this country. I'm going to fight to make sure that women have protections for comprehensive health care and reproductive justice in this country. It's an economic security for women and their families, and I'm going to fight to protect it. This is an environment where so much is at stake, and New Mexico families can't afford to wait. My mother can't afford to wait. My daughter can't afford to wait. We can't afford to wait. I respectfully ask for your vote. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.